Well, hello everybody. Welcome to YouTube Masterclass. This is a Coursera course for Harvard. You can take credit from Coursera for Harvard School or University of Southern California. You can get credit there, and they have a film school there. They don't at Harvard. We're trying to get that in place, at least to the point where you can earn a degree or a minor in film. We're still discussing it. I think it's going to work. Just it's going to take years of teaching, professing on my part and going through them to get their answers because they ask me for answers on the same questions. And then there's also the University of Southern California is the best film school in the world. I mean, there's no better film school than it. I mean, UCLA, I went there and it's a great film school, but USC, man, nothing can even top that. So I'm just saying, and then we also do it for Calarts, and Calarts is the hardest program to get a PhD, and I think even more so than like an art PhD at Harvard would be harder at Calarts because it's more artistically intensified. So there's my credentials. I've got PhDs from Harvard and Calarts, and I don't have a PhD at USC because I got my bachelor's there. But I did get a master's in production, so here we go. We're talking about Quentin Tarantino, the Auteur. And I think what's important, with lecture one, we just dove right into Reservoir Dogs, and we're not done with Reservoir Dogs yet, but I wanted to talk more about the historical context of the Auteur because I didn't go through that, and that's usually a good introduction. So, I mean, we're thinking of the history of film, and we know that sound film is really a big transition in 1927 with the jazz singer. That it's strangely this Jewish singer at a church, at one of his churches or wherever it is, his synagogue that he sings for, and that he goes out at night and is like a jazz club singer that wears blackface. And there's so much you could say about the jazz singer. I mean, it's so important. And I know that the jazz singer has a clip in the movie Goodfellas, and I know that movie's very influential on Tarantino. And the historical context of this is that like the Tarantino films are sound films, but there's even contexts that he has used the style of silent film, even as there's no real heard dialogue in the scene. And I was going to talk more about the scene, but in the scene where Steve Buscemi comes running out and the camera goes past him and it's all that long take. It's like we timed it. It's like a 5 minute long take or a 6 minute long take that they left in the version we had of Reservoir Dogs. I don't know if it was a director's cut or what. I think it was. But so he goes running out and the camera goes past him and follows him. And it's a big long tracking shot where this shootout and bank robbery takes place. And nobody really says anything. There's a couple of times where he's like, shoot, because he runs into something, you can barely hear him. But like, there's like a technique of like Gun Crazy from the 40s, and Gun Crazy is like a technique from film noir, which makes its way back to, say, German Expressionism with like Pandora's Box or The Last Laugh, and how those films would later gravitate towards what these like Fritz Lang, like Woman in the Window type movies later in America. Ironically, the German Expressionism and film noir were similar, and Fritz Lang worked in both of them. So he's like, and we're going to talk more about that when we get to Inglourious Basterds section, because I mean, there's other languages in Inglourious Basterds, and they don't translate everything to English like your typical Hollywood film. It's even more interesting than Mel Gibson's translations of only one language, because now Tarantino's got French, German, Italian, all in the same film, and it's like other languages too. I think there's other languages in that, and we'll look at that. But that's really interesting because multi-language cultures exist in places other than where we are here in this kind of like rural suburban town, and like the multiculturalism would have other languages being their own languages. And I don't remember a film that actually had more than one language, Maybe there's foreign films. I mean, like French films like Grand Illusion had the German, the Swedish, and the French. So it is that way. I'm not trying to exaggerate it, but the point is these silent films were setting, especially the German Expressionism, were setting the boundaries for kind of like what film noir would be. Now, film noir would also be affected by gangster films in the 30s, and these are big influence on Tarantino with James Cagney and Paul Mooney and The Scarface by Howard Hawks, and these came out in the 30s in the sound era after the jazz singer. So now we've got sort of this German Expressionism going to the sound era. And right as we're getting into that, the film noir comes back in because it's easier to make and it's considerably cheaper to make a film noir film. But then Fritz Lang starts spicing it up and it gets just as expensive as his other movies, only now it's listed as a B movie, but it costs money to make. And here we're getting to the idea of exploitation filmmaking. And I think the point is that the film noir really gravitated all the way to grunt when it hit gun crazy. You pretty much knew they were gonna do that again, but it would have to be like a really good, strong, brave director to take on a scene where it's the all one take of a bank robbery. And I can tell you that that's a silent film technique, having the camera go past Buster Keaton and then watching him walk back in. I mean, some of us have tried that trick, but that he staged it that way was only because of the location of the camera scrolling along, and that's what we're getting an image of. So it's like self-reflexive of this camera, and we kind of went past him, and now he's going to go past it later. So very tricky, but also the black and white flashbacks in Reservoir Dogs. I mean, I was going to talk about it later, but the black and white flashbacks are very, throwback to like silent film. Also a throwback to like the opposite of Raging Bull, where the flashbacks are in color and the rest of the film's in black and white. And there's a lot of Scorsese references in Tarantino. There's a lot of also racial dilemmas that we're not going to talk about quite yet because we're still in Reservoir Dogs. And Reservoir Dogs is one of those films that was out from 1993 to 1998. It was out 5 years. I think it was the longest a movie ran up to then. Because Titanic, I know, ran for 12 years, and there's Avatar is still running. And I think it's not to say that Reservoir Dogs ran the most, but for a sleeper hit that was really big, it was weird that Reservoir Dogs was still out in theaters when Pulp Fiction came out and went out, and when Jackie Brown came in and came out, Reservoir Dogs was still playing in theaters. I'm not kidding. It was the most popular one. Like, now everybody jumps to Pulp Fiction, but they'd never seen anything like Reservoir Dogs. And the conversations keep people coming back. And we were assigned to go see it, like, for our student newspaper. We had to go see it like 7 times, and I even upped the challenge to 8, and we were spending all this money at the theater and going to see Reservoir Dogs, and it was like a regular thing. And I remember that it was out so long, and we just kept going back. And I remember my cousin Jason and I went finally at the end of the 5-year run, and Jason found out that it was the last time they were showing. He's a professor in L.A. He said, this is the last time they're showing Reservoir Dogs for this whole run, and I want to see it myself now, because he's like, I've seen parts of it, but he's like, I waited till it had to leave theaters only so I could be the only one in the theater. With you, No, he didn't say with me. We're not that sentimental. But we went and saw it that one last time, and we kind of felt sad that it was the last time we'd be able to see it in a theater. It was like this last great convincing epic, and then like Titanic and Avatar come out, and they're all huge. But what was unpredicted was Reservoir Dogs. It's when it's a lower budget movie, even intentionally, that if it makes that much money, then it's making money because it didn't cost that much to make, and everybody's watching it for 5 years. I mean, a 5-year theater run is impressive. I don't know, they don't do those really as much, but the theater chains now, we'll get to that, they're kind of dying out and having some struggles, and I don't know if it's because they're not vertically integrated, like that the studios don't run the theaters, but they can't because of the Paramount Trust Act in 1946. But the theaters aren't really being neglected so much, or high prices or anything. It's just that the event of going to the movie and being prioritized and putting movies above every other activity has kind of died down. Not really because of like the AI generation, and I felt it was kind of dangerous for AI to take on this position that anybody could make any type of film they wanted, because then they could take old films and change them around and present them as though those are the real movies. They did that enough with VHS, and DVD made that a little less of a problem, that if I put it on... Let me just ask you a question as an audience and as students. If you were to put an AI onto every one of your movies so that it all had a happy ending, like Reservoir Dogs has a happy ending because you're AIing it that way, then you're doing it wrong. Because I don't think the movie is intended to be changed just because the computer logs into some movie and changes it some other way. Even the movie Grumpy Cat would get effed up. They'd all have to leave him home alone. They'd go to church, and then Grumpy Cat would have to fight like the thieves coming into the house or something. Like, it doesn't make sense, dude. I mean, I don't mind like randomness and weird numbers appearing on a page, and that happens anyway when I write. It's random enough. But I don't really... preach against AI so much because I've used it. We can use it, but like not in your writing. You know, you can't use it in your writing because then everything would turn. Whoever would be in control would make it so the writing was all like his, and so instead of being like everybody else's, in consideration too. So like, just think about this: if some Christian huckster like evangelist came along and put a bunch of Christian AI into things, and they start showing It's a Wonderful Life, and at the end, it's got Pasolini's Jesus on the cross. Well, I like Pasolini's Jesus. He was born and bred for that role, but I don't see it mixing with It's a Wonderful Life, really. I guess the Gospel according to St. Matthew and It's a Wonderful Life, they just don't compare in the Christmas cheer, do they? But anyway, they might be a good couple made in heaven. This is Reservoir Dogs. We've been talking about it a little bit, and I'm going to put the more historical context is by the time you get to the 60s, say, exploitation film starts coming in, and that's like when Psycho comes out in 1960, and then later it's Return of the Living Dead, Night of the Living Dead, in 1968. By then, 2001: A Space Odyssey's out, so you're seeing these brilliant, like, stable shots of, like, beautiful things, and yeah, we'll see that there's a lot of beautiful shots of stable thing, but more people like in a Kubrick shot because it's kind of like this backmasked matte that looks more realistic than us looking through a telescope, And so after Night of the Living Dead and all that, the exploitation film, let me just define that. That is any film that is made on the cheap, made on the fly, sometimes has a famous person in them who takes a pay cut, usually has an exploitation director who's known for his style and that, and is it blood and guts? Usually is it nudity? Probably some, and is it totally serving an interest of like pure entertainment? Unsure of it, but that I find some of the things artistic about those exploitation films, like how eventually that would influence the style of Andy Warhol, where he's taking long pictures of just someone sitting there, not much is happening, and making it seem like this epic movie just because it's out of focus, half of it, and not the other. So, the whole Andy Warhol movement and the exploitation film, it's like making them cheap on the fly, but they're still as good as gold. And you see how they're as good as gold with, like, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, which is co-written by Roger Ebert, which is why I think he's a really great person and great critic. He passed away, but Roger Ebert was a great critic. And he wrote Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, and I thought, well, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls that's a pretty hard one to beat. And then on top of that, it was Russ Meyer that made the movie, so it was like, it was already, they were wondering what he would be like as a director because he'd made some underground movies, and they were still like these skin flicks, these exploitation films, but just because I don't make those kind of movies really doesn't mean those movies don't exist. I mean, like the whole idea of Grindhouse is to go back to the exploitation movie format and make it look like it's all, like the film stock's exploding, or like there's parts of the film that go wild, and there's like things that go wrong with the film. And I think they're doing that as a throwback to exploitation, like they're making it cheap on the fly. But this is one of those movies where they spend a lot of money on making the B movie popular. And I think that came along with postmodernism, because postmodernism, which kind of comes in around the time of Night of the Living Dead, was around the time in France that the French critics, Foucault, Lacan, and Derrida, started talking about like Marxism and people's personal rights, and how, women should be able to go to school. And so women should be able to go to school in 1967, the philosophy of 67, 68. Women should be able to go to school is the most prominent message, that they should be treated as equals. Prominent message. Postmodernism comes from that post-colonial, post-structural system that the French are dealing with in criticism. And if the French are dealing with it in criticism, then they know what they're talking about, because that's all they study is like the critical thinking skills that illustrate what makes the film work, what makes the film go. And if there's any complaints, they don't really hide them. Me, I don't really have any complaints with any movie. I like all movies. I think all movies are great. Sometimes I prefer movies. Like, I prefer Reservoir Dogs to some films, to a lot of films. There's a lot of films I love, but let's say, like a film that I don't like as much, I don't want to mention. So yeah, I don't really mention my complaints either, but I'm just telling you, I'd much rather sit back and watch Reservoir Dogs for the 20th, 30th time and catch something new I haven't seen than go back to like some other like kids cartoon that I didn't really want to watch in the first place, or was just making fun of on my show. And I'm not bashing on kids cartoons, okay? Kids cartoons are awesome. I've done some myself, but I don't really want to watch them over and over like I want to watch Reservoir Dogs over and over. And the reason why isn't because it's animation or live action. It's because Tarantino uses style in an expressive, stylistic way, and his style is making the film, and that you can totally recognize that it's him. It really comes about in Pulp Fiction when you've seen something second, but if you're watching his debut, you're like, this is already an amazing debut. It's just like he was saying on the TV show that he was coming out with this movie, and everybody'd been using him as screenwriter. Natural Born Killers and True Romance. He was a screenwriter on those. He wrote those scripts, and I'm thinking, I've never written a script that good. Man, that's good. Those are two good. Those are two of the most golden scripts I've ever read the actual script to, like in book form. And those are golden, and they used to sell them in those book forms, And Pulp Fiction, it won at the Cannes Film Festival, and I think only 5 American films had won up to that point in the Cannes Film Festival, and I didn't know what they are. I think that one is with Brando and Maria Shriver. I can't remember what that film's called all of a sudden. And it's like, so the reason I brought that film up that has Brando and Maria Shriver, and it's called Last Tango in Paris, there you go, is because they were kind of doing that whole thing where they do big budget exploitation, because here it is being like this chick and this dude get together in this like small apartment that doesn't have any furniture or anything, and it kind of gets rough, and it gets rough footage and everything, but that Pauline Kael defended that movie as a work of art is already true, because if Pauline Kael describes something as a work of art, it definitely is. And you can't really, one thing I like about the really stiff critics like Ebert and Kael is that they really, once they've stuck it out there, they're probably not going to change their opinion. And two, everybody wants to know what they have to say before they make a decision on the film, even me. I got to go check whether they liked it before I can say I really like this film, So that, and Roger Ebert was a big lover of Pulp Fiction. It was his favorite movie of the 90s, which, as much as he loved 90s cinema, that's saying a lot. That's saying a lot. If Pulp Fiction was his favorite movie of the 90s, probably one of his favorite movies ever made. And we had another, this professor I used to have, Dana Poland, write this Pulp Fiction book, and we'll look at this. Maybe we'll get to it today, I'm not sure, but the closing out remarks on the history of film as we get to the 70s, now everybody's making these kind of like big budget exploitation films, but now The Exorcist comes out in the vein of Night of the Living Dead and gets really intense, really visually graphic, really like crazy with the religion, and then all of a sudden it like scores a blockbuster, the first blockbuster ever. It made like 373 million, and anything that went over 100 million is a blockbuster. So now you pretty much have to have a blockbuster with your film to break even in the films that are going out to like small towns like my own. You only get the film, you don't really get the art films as much. Here it's not like 400 Blows is playing downtown, but it could be someday, and I could be part of that movement, and that'd be really cool. I'm not bagging on the town. I'm just saying they put up big structural movies, and they say, go see this because we got to pay for the movie, and then everybody goes see it, and they don't mind. And I don't see that as a grotesque nature of capital like some of those Marxists would, but I do see the grotesque nature of capital when it discludes women, because women don't necessarily have to be robbed from their pay just because they're women, and they should get the vote. There's things I agree with on that side of things too, where it's like, I don't think the fringe critics were wrong for saying that women don't deserve to be treated bad. And how that's been associated with the fringe liberal critics, are they the only ones that are polite? I don't know. I'm not sure. Why it's a French liberal critic thing to be polite to women? Does that make the French suck? Not to me. Like, well, if their biggest critics were saying make the Sorbonne co-ed, so we don't have to shut down the city, and they shut down the city because they didn't make the... And finally the Sorbonne comes out and makes the campus co-ed. And I don't know what all their rules are. I don't know how old you have to be to get your doctorate at Sorbonne. You have to be like 75, 65. So, but getting back to the subject, there's these films that come along, like let's say Dogma 95, around the same time of these independent films. Those were all part of the foreign independent film craze that went wild. And Dogma, it's like Dogma 95 is natural acting, natural light, natural sound, and natural settings. And I forgot to mention natural light last time, but if you use all those settings, then like you call them and you pay for it, and then you can have your Dogma attached. And I don't know that they aren't just a glorified form of independent in a foreign country, which I love that because that means somebody's not really dictating them the same things that they have to show to be in America. And I'm not really criticizing America in that. I'm just saying sometimes it's good for a change up on culture so you can see how other people do things just so you don't get in the rut of only knowing your own culture. And I recommend doing this because it gives you a larger worldview. Like if you're a writer and you have a larger worldview than just your own world around you, then maybe you might just write something so fantastic as a fantasy story or something that you've never seen. And they do that all the time, writers. And the more you expand your multicultural world, the more your world will expand as a writer, I'm telling you. But here's what's interesting about Tarantino is by the time he's getting the Scorsese De Palma style, De Palma went from Greetings to Mission Impossible in this amazing slew of excellent movies that goes through Body Double. There's so many, and Blowout, and there's so many good. Blowout was like a remake of Blow Up by Michelangelo Antonioni, and he had those two girls wrestling on the floor with the lead actor, and somehow that became Blowout, which is where they hear the murder on the soundtrack rather than see the murder in the picture. And yeah, so the thing is that De Palma's making all these crafty movies. He's got like The Outsiders and everything. Not The Outsiders, sorry, that's Coppola. What is it? The Untouchables. Yeah, The Untouchables. Excuse me on that one. The Untouchables is kind of this like different kind of a De Palma movie because now De Palma's doing the Scarface gangster film, but he's doing it in this kind of classical Hollywood way. So he has the violence, but it's kind of these classy images of like straightforward things, and then the destruction of them through these like guys, the Untouchables that can't be killed. And so the De Palma thing with Carrie and Greetings and all that at the beginning of while the exploitation film was going on. Then there was the blaxploitation era, and the blaxploitation era is going to be a big movement to influence Tarantino, which is why I find it so interesting that sometimes racial charged emotions can be brought up about his films because he's totally taking the style from a blaxploitation film. Like, I'm not sure if that makes the content any less traumatic for someone who doesn't want to hear some F-bombs in a movie and some other bad language. But the racial thing, I kind of said, well, I'm going to put it aside, really, because he's so into blaxploitation that, like, I don't have any trouble that he likes blaxploitation. It's like, that doesn't make me dislike him. If somebody was offended by that, they wouldn't support his films, but I'm sure it wouldn't take down his typical audience, who is everybody else in the world who has a conscience and knows what they're talking about. Because I don't get why it's racist of him to present blaxploitation. Because weren't there already like white and Jewish filmmakers of the blaxploitation movies anyway? And they were saying they were exploiting them, but now they look back on them as like these works of arts that like the African Americans like Melvin Van Peebles, and I agree with that, they're works of art. I'll go on that side all the time, blaxploitation movies on Facebook, and it's like, the movies are great. It's like you got Coffee, you got Foxy Brown, you got Superfly, you got Shaft, you got Sweetback. Those are the 5 big ones, and I think Tarantino was really influenced by those films. In fact, you can so see it in Jackie Brown, which is kind of like this do-over of Foxy Brown, like later in her life. Like later in Foxy Brown's life, what's she doing? Besides popping a cap in everybody, I'm just saying, like the thing about having Pam Grier play Jackie Brown and Pam Grier already played Foxy Brown should have probably noted out that Tarantino's not really to be considered really a racist director. I don't know if things changed after Jackie Brown, but they were one way in Pulp Fiction, one way in Jackie Brown. And my African-American professor, Dr. Boyd, had said that he prefers Jackie Brown because it's more realistic to how they would talk and what you would say and how you would act around that situation. But in Pulp Fiction, it's kind of this fantasy world, and the theater gets kind of expressive, in the way it's stylized, and so now you're hearing words just for the shock effect of it. And the movie Pulp Fiction has so much shock effect that, like, it was known as almost too much when it came out. Now it's okay, but, like, it was so frenetic and so wild when you were watching it back then, an action film like that, that you just, like, you get really tense watching it, because it's like Hitchcock, it's like every few minutes we erupt in shock and surprise and kind of suspense, because we've set this all up, and down the chain you'll see that, like, the original, that Tarantino is also big on the setups. So he'll set something up at the beginning with some random speech, at a restaurant, like in Grindhouse, Death Proof. But then later it'll all come true in a different, ironic and different way at the end of the movie. So however they set it up is usually how it winds down in the middle and totally comes to a head at the climactic ending. And that's a really great way to do that, is to set up a MacGuffin. And, in Pulp Fiction has the ultimate MacGuffin. It's the briefcase. Nobody knows what the briefcase is. And, like, if you turn the code on the briefcase to 666, then the briefcase opens, but they don't ever show you what's in it. It's like this glowing thing, Adam, and it was really expressive. So you get this idea that, like, now the words are kind of caustic because they're in this fantasy world, but I still don't buy that Pulp Fiction's not really a throwback to blaxploitation too. And the reason I say that is because Samuel L. Jackson sort of is the character that gets away with it all and gets the job done and lives through it, supposedly. I don't know. But he doesn't ever get disenfranchised, Samuel L. Jackson. Everybody else in the movie gets disenfranchised in one way or another. Bruce Willis is forced to be a boxer, so he kills someone on accident, so he's disenfranchised. Marcellus Wallace gets disenfranchised by a scene I'd rather not discuss because of what Bell Hooks said about that scene making her mad, because then she felt like the leader that was African American, got it hardest and totally disenfranchised. And, well, I think the point of that is because Samuel L. Jackson ends up being even more badass than anybody in the movie, and that's the real trick to the film that you don't notice, except that he puts it all out of sequence, mainly to put Samuel L. Jackson's speech in the restaurant at the end of the movie, and that the whole movie hinges around Samuel L. Jackson's quoting of the Bible. What's interesting is he's quoting the Tarantino Bible. Okay, we discussed this because the Bible does not have anything cool in it, and Tarantino writes a better Bible than a Bible. I want to read the Tarantino Bible only. But we're just getting this like, Sunday school lesson, but he's this big, hard gangster, is how he's putting them all to shame, telling them to be cool, and then telling them he's God, and then he walks out and pays the check, and then he gives them all his money to buy back his life. It's this whole scene that he's just, I'm more badass than you, so get out my way, dude. To me, that's blaxploitation. It's not like just saying that black people suck, but so they have to show up in, like, movies that are gritty and urbane. It's more like they can handle roles that are more off the mainstream because they got no other part to play, unless they're like Sidney Poitier or Paul Robeson. And I'm not saying that those guys weren't great, because they were freaking fantastic. I like Body and Soul with Paul Robeson. It's a crazy movie too. The priest is, like, corrupt again in a Michaud film, and it's like he's stealing all this money. It's like the story of that corrupt preacher and Within Our Gates, but now it's this morose version in Body and Soul, and it's like, I don't know if Body and Soul is a sound film. I think it was. Or no, there was a silent version too, and I think Oscar Michaud did both of them. And Oscar Michaud, you can see your influence on Tarantino in the sense that the Klansmen are made to look duped in Django Unchained. And yeah, we'll just leave it at that. The Klansmen are duped in Django Unchained, and that's kind of like any movie that would take a stance on the Klansmen being doomed, which is like Oscar Michaud. So we got that there. That Reservoir Dogs has only a few more things to discuss, so that I didn't get in the first lecture, then we'll really move on to Pulp Fiction, is that Reservoir Dogs has flashbacks in black and white. That's very French New Wave, Not that the French New Wave wouldn't take longer takes, maybe, but that they would have these flashbacks in black and white was only in one version of the film I saw. And what's really interesting is I've seen the version that's all in color, and I've seen the version that's all in black and white, and I like both of them.
They released both versions to theater. There was a black and white version originally, and when it had such big box office, they switched it to color just to see if they could do like kind of a monotone thing with the color film and make it look like monochrome, like a 70s. And the 70s films like Exorcist and then later Jaws and Star Wars really hit the medium. And really, Pulp Fiction's like the Star Wars of gangster films because it's got the whole cast. It's got all the pastiche from, Public Enemy with James Cagney, but it's got all the, criminality of My Life to Live. Where Uma Thurman's wig in this is definitely Anna Karina type hairdo from those John Paul Belmondo movies. But My Life to Live doesn't have John Paul Belmondo, but Pierre LeFou does. That Anna Karina has that same haircut in My Life to Live is not a coincidence, but was actually planned for. That's a really cool poster, and then you have the Jackie Brown one below. And why I'm holding this 3 disc because I have another copy of Pulp Fiction. I'm gonna get it out next time, but we need to finish up with Reservoir Dogs. So it comes out in 1993, and this is the independent movement. Now, the independent movement, what makes it independent is that they don't rely necessarily on Hollywood for the pay of the film, the release of the film, or even the exhibition of the film. Like, you pretty much have to do that yourself. But that nowadays you can get an independent film signed with a big studio is possible because big studios are willing to run the indie films because of the financial nature of it. And a lot of that was because of the reception of Reservoir Dogs and how long it ran. As an art film more leaned towards the art film media, it certainly took in a lot more money than it costs to make, and that's rare for a film because usually the film would be so expensive that it's just got to break even and make all its money back. But now they're like, no, we want to make another movie. We're already making Pulp Fiction before Reservoir Dogs was done. That's right, they started filming Pulp Fiction before they were done with Reservoir Dogs, and they had the script for it and everything. Pulp Fiction was going around script. They were almost going to let Tony Scott direct it. And then because Tarantino proved himself with Reservoir Dogs, he was able to direct Pulp Fiction, but he couldn't direct Pulp Fiction till like Reservoir Dogs was 3/4 of the way done, but Pulp Fiction was the one he wanted to start with. Not necessarily because Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction were all part of the same movie originally, and then they got released separately, and then they became two separate entities. And that this was an independent movement kind of thing that I like because it's like the idea of even George Lucas going back on Star Wars and changing things. It's like if I'm the director and I want to release another version, I should be able to without any complaints. I know it may not have this and this scene in it that everybody loves, but it's got this scene and this in it, which hasn't been seen, and everybody's going to love it. And you can't really, after Reservoir Dogs, you can't really question Tarantino's motives. Like, he's in it to make cinema for the sake of cinema. He is definitely Kubrickian in the sense that he's going to go forward with it, or Scorsese, like, go forward, damn the torpedoes, we're going to do this. And those guys are studio directors, and I know Hollywood classical cinema kind of influences his films. That's kind of the straight cutting, proscenium, shot, reverse shot, 180 degree. And he does use some of those setups, but most of the setups of Reservoir Dogs have the characters standing facing the camera with their ties and suits so they can be seen as the men in suits. That they're walking in slow motion sometimes at the beginning, the drum beats going off right to the switch of the frame. Makes for this really well-made cinematic experience. The aesthetics of the film are so enriched by Tarantino's knowledge of how film works and how to put it together on a film and how to make it happen, that he totally hits it out of the ballpark on Reservoir Dogs, and it stays out till 98. And now everybody's forgotten what that one even was, and that it was the one where the guy gets his ear cut off. Everybody remembered that all of a sudden. They're like, whoa, I haven't seen that film in years. Is it still good? And I'm like, is it still good? It's great. Like, I'm not the one that should be responsible for it still being good, but I'm telling you, I am responsible for that. It's still good. You watch it and you go, this is like nothing I've ever seen. And, I think the mock-ups in Reservoir Dogs where they had the interview scenes with the sort of dawn of the mafia. Michael Madsen's kind of talking to Chris Penn. They're talking to the mafioso leader. And they kind of put the wall in the middle of the depth of field so that it would look closer up. And then so it'd be kind of a framier reverse shot on the window in the guide. It's almost like docu-realism in that. And I thought, there's some handheld camera. There's, the whole idea of a natural born killers coming to life has to do with that Godardian express the stylization like My Life to Live or something, because you're using the aesthetics to draw attention to themselves, because you're saying, hey, I'm the director, this is what I get to do, and I love doing this, and this is how good I am at it. The pastiche is kind of a show-off move rather than a sell-out move is important to note. Because pastiche is usually like, nope, we're doing the next in scene like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, let's do it. You know, and so Steven Spielberg's like, well, I want to do this scene like Night Train to Munich in my film Munich. You know, it's like, okay, that makes sense, but it's a work of art, so they're showing off that they can do those scenes too, and then draw attention to film history. It's not so much a sellout technique because everybody gets a creative image from everywhere else. You know, just because in postmodernism, we revel getting our creative images from other places. But everybody revels in getting, you know, their kind of artwork covered, and then everybody, you know, so they're not gonna say Tarantino's a phony. They're not gonna say he's a fake just because he remade these Godard movies or like perfected them. He's showing off because he's such a badass that he can. And then he knows that by his second film is really interesting because Reservoir Dogs hasn't even been released yet. One of the reasons I think it stayed out so long is because a lot of people thought that it was like nothing they'd ever seen, and it really wasn't. And that's what makes it a significant film. Pulp Fiction, in irony, put Reservoir Dogs back on the map and kept it out, because now that people are going to see Pulp Fiction that didn't see Reservoir Dogs or did, want to go back and watch Reservoir Dogs and figure out how that was the same movie if it really was. So if it was the same movie if it really was. And like then that he decided to release Pulp Fiction as this Elmore Leonard thing, and that keeps coming up in like Jackie Brown and some other movies where it's like this told out of sequence story. Well, Reservoir Dogs is kind of told out of sequence with the flashbacks and the runarounds and the things that could have happened before or after. But in Pulp Fiction, it's like frame by frame, we're going intolerance with this and switching stories. But see, Intolerance, rapid fire switching stories. I don't know how they did that. That's hard to do, rapid fire switching stories like Cloud Atlas. But Pulp Fiction tells one long story, but it's out of sequence in terms of events happening chronologically. So now we've got that Godardian achronology that usually he hides but is there. And achronology is a really hard one to figure out because there's those achronologist things like an occurrence at Owl Creek. The flashbacks are achronological, but they go in order of his life, so they're still kind of in a pattern. I don't think any other film prepared us for the out of chronology workshop that we had to go to other than Pulp Fiction. I mean, there are other films that go out of sequence, and I don't know, The Graduate maybe goes a little, but it still seems chronological, even though it's in media res, which means it comes into the film with the action already going on. So we're just going to say, to be safe, that there are some, well, stage fright again, she sees something that didn't happen. Rashomon is the same event told over and over, but Rashomon would be the closest one to Pulp Fiction in terms of achronological, because in Rashomon, you had the first story told, and then the second story, it's the same characters, but different things happen in a different way depending on the motive of the person telling the story about what happened. So it's 4 different points of view on a story, one from a ghost, and they're all the same story, but they're told differently. It just means that, like, who caused what. And they kind of have some of that in Reservoir Dogs, where you're tricked into thinking one thing's happening, and it seems like the same clip, or it could be the same clip from a different angle, and then you're like juxtaposed with what else they've got to show you from that point, and then you kind of forget that you saw a repetitious moment. But in Rashomon, they're really saying, hey, check it out. It's the same story 4 times, and it's different every time. Not just because the camera angle is different, but the story itself is different, but it's the same story. So it's like this prostitute that gets caught in the woods, and she gets brutally hurt, and then like her husband dies of shame, and the samurai gets caught. But in each version, something different happens, like standing out from the other versions. Like, you know, there's something different about each story, and you kind of have to figure out which one's real and But in Pulp Fiction, you get this real big drawn attention to that you're seeing not the same stories over, but the same world and same story with all the same actors and characters, Samuel L. Jackson, John Travolta, Amy Thurman. They're in the same universe, but it's shown out of sequence from the way it would be in temporal reality. That's how the time would play out in the real world. And so it doesn't get confusing, but it leads you more to thinking that he really knows his cinema so well that he can put ending on beginning or back to forward, like an Orson Welles type. Because Citizen Kane's another one, a chronological movie like Pulp Fiction in a lot of ways, because it jumps around on the timeline almost randomly, and that it's not random because there's usually something thematic about, is driven by the characters and the narrative that's driving through his life in out-of-sequence reality. And that it's so aesthetic is another thing Pulp Fiction is, and by that, I don't mean Reservoir Dogs isn't aesthetic. Reservoir Dogs is aesthetic to the point of no wonder it was a blockbuster. But Pulp Fiction really has this sort of Art Nouveau, like big, like French New Wave, like sort of big splashy colors like Maxo Fool or something, Lola Montes, like these reds that are just as hard-hitting as the reds and Meet Me in St. Louis and stuff. It's boom, Reservoir Dogs has that red color in the background and on this even cover. And I just think of, and you should see the red in the Pulp Fiction cover, but I don't know. So it's more Art Nouveau, and so it draws attention to its framework, not only as being achronological, but having freeze frames, having an image drawn in the sky of a square with Uma Thurman in front of John Travolta at the 50s restaurant. The 50s restaurant scene is so retroactive and nostalgic that you're thinking that even you, if you've seen the movie before, you can name all the people that they're naming. Basically, James Steen walks through, but it's not really James Steen. It's like somebody playing him in a 50s restaurant kind of mock-up. And so you're seeing all these characters. But Pulp Fiction's really wild with the reversals of fortune. The comic book environment kind of comes from the gangsterism in it, where they're like the Brian De Palma Scarface gangsters, where they're really violent and they're trigger happy in a way. They're kind of ready to kill someone at any minute. They've had to kill before. They kill for a living. And then Samuel L. Jackson does quote the Tarantino Bible, which I'm not going to give the Bible credit for coming up with that line. It couldn't have been written good in the Bible. It was good written in the movie. And that he's eating a burger, shooting a dude, and reciting this scripture is kind of a comic book environment. But it's also that he's this larger-than-life mafioso boss. And here we get, again, the villain that's morally ambiguous, who seems really good, like a good guy, but is totally evil in his spare time, And that's John Travolta, too. John Travolta clearly plays against his type in this film, because normally he's sort of the Grease, I'm, a teenage heartthrob type guy. I don't need to... But then he's kind of doing these action movie roles later in his career in the 90s. And then I think it's cool that John Travolta's in Pulp Fiction. It goes back to that nostalgic, retroactive style of like Saturday Night Fever. And like all those things that made 70s films great. And that Pulp Fiction's like a history of 60s and 70s movies. It's so true. That's the Art Nouveau factor. And it even goes into like some Warhol. And, there's just images in Pulp Fiction that stand out in your mind from the film as being some of the most important images we've seen in film. Like, it's like you don't want to miss a second, because you get these scenes, and here's in a restaurant where you see one of the actors play. Oh, it's the Honey Bunny, and it's played by I should know this. She's like a really cool actress, Amanda Plummer. Sorry, I didn't have that in the book. I was looking for it in the book, and that always throws me off. That's why we're pretty much a closed book course, because then I have to look it back up, and I've made notes all throughout this book. Like the Bell Hooks quote I found was in here about like how Marcellus Wallace is disenfranchised as a black man, and he falls out of power because of the fact that he's hit by those two redneck dudes that are killing everybody and taking their time doing it, and they're in that shop, and they bring out the gimp, and then Bruce Willis saves the day. This book also explains that, as like Bruce Willis is going for a baseball bat, then he goes for a chainsaw, then he sees a sword, And he goes down with a sword and fights that guy, but he has to like pick between Texas Chainsaw Massacre or, you know, the Yakuza blade. And then he's kind of got the baseball bat like he's Field of Dreams guy. No, I'm kidding. No, he's the apostle with the bat. He should have went with the bat, man, like Robert Duvall with a bat. Talk about Robert Duvall's Bible is better than my Bible. I don't know where he gets his, but I want the Hollywood Bible, dude. That one sounds rad. They have all these cool verses in it. Mine sucks. It's like, God loves you, but's gonna kill you anyway. Next part. God loves you so much, he's gonna kill you. No, I'm not trying to. Oh, that reminds me. Tarantino's in this great scene in Adam Sandler's Little Nicky, and this just goes to show that he's been in some kooky roles as far as like some of his extracurricular activities as an actor to do favors for people or whatever. So he did this one part in Little Nicky, and I can't remember who that was directed by. Little Nicky had this part where Tarantino's a priest, and he's like sitting there and he's like condemning, he's like telling everybody they're cool, and then he like condemns Little Nicky. He's like, the Lord loves you, and the Lord loves you, and you make the Lord very nervous. And I brought that joke up because it's just perfect for like Tarantino, because he's like this eccentric kind of character that's like Woody Allen type, where you know his personality. You've seen him in Reservoir Dogs already. You know he can make a badass movie. You know he can get away with almost anything in his movies, which is why sometimes he even puts him in there, is so that he can just get away with it. And I don't have anything against someone that's putting in something in a movie to show off. Because showing off a lot of times is by these directors who know what they're doing. It's not pretentious. Because they know how they're putting it together in the film. And one thing I like about Tarantino is, as highbrow as his acting and as highbrow as his edits are and his production design, he doesn't mind if the characters go a little lowbrow sometimes and talk about Madonna music videos, not just for pop culture effect, but also it's an understatement of like his movies still have the pop cultural element. I mean, they're the ultimate in postmodernism. They cover every multiple point of view you could by changing time around. And then they combine every kind of knowledge by changing all the characters around and putting these chapters like Godard in it. And then that the film is experimental in style is one thing, but the pop cultural references within that sphere of pastiche versus techniques he makes himself that seem Kubrickian but seem totally Tarantino. And by totally Tarantino, it can be more lowbrow than Kubrick. You can actually see a guy getting clobbered, or see a guy getting shot at, or see a guy escaping from a bank robbery, and really see that in the film as kind of a low technique, because these gangsters are like low lives. But they're not. They end up being as cool as Tarantino, and they have to clean a blown up head off their car. You know, I always wondered that in Brian De Palma's Scarface, how they cleaned up all those heads that were blown off in the back of the car. There's one at the beginning of the movie and one at the end. I swear 2 people get their heads blown off in a car. And it reminds me of Coffee, when she kills that dude at the beginning of the movie that's trying to get on her. I didn't like that I'll leave you with this. I didn't like that they said the N-word in Pulp Fiction, but I still think that in the circumstance that they were in, someone would have certainly used that word. That it's a fantasy film, you don't use the N-word necessarily, but that someone in that situation, whether they were white or black, and just found out the head exploded on a car and that they had to clean it up, I wouldn't be surprised if they used the N-word in real life. That's what I always told them about that scene, but I understand the film kind of has this fantasy effect, and plus that wasn't as harsh back then, because it was like just coming in that was like something that cops used to like intimidate African Americans, you know. And then later in Django Unchained, you hear that word a million times. Everybody's saying, oh, Tarantino's so racist because his word's here. But now we're going, well, he's teetering it towards the villain. And that everybody's a villain in Pulp Fiction, I love, because everybody's a villain. So it's like you can get mad at the characters in Pulp Fiction because they're villains. You may not like that dude they just shot, but you may like that dude they just shot, but you got to move on. You know, mortality is a realism that's in postmodernism, but it's also like, but there are other characters in the story. You know, so let's move on. So next time, when we get more into Pulp Fiction, and we'll hit it headlong about what it's about and all the characteristics it has. And I'm warning you, the Pulp Fiction lecture that started today may go on for a while, and I may do what I did in the Griffith class towards Birth of the Nation and refer back to Pulp Fiction many times. That I would say the ur text is Reservoir Dogs. I like the
Reservoir Dogs is kind of this black and white thing, and Pulp Fiction is kind of like this explosive depth of field, kind of like Art Nouveau, like, like 2001: A Space Odyssey colors, really staunch and identical to what the seeming context of the situation is, even as comic book reality kind of makes it feel. So thank you for stopping by today. We'll have our next class in like 5 or 6 days. I hope you all have had a wonderful holiday. It's been great getting back into this, the second day of Tarantino class. And there's 16 classes, so there's 14 to go. So join the class, pay Coursera, take the final, get some units in film studies. All right. Good night, everybody.